Good morning. This is your grandfather speaking, and I'm going to give you a story of my life that I think you will find interesting. This is going to run for a little while, so be patient. And today is September 27th, 2019. I want to go back to my grandfather's early time. This was about 1901, 1902, before my father was born, and my father was the oldest one in his family. And they were living in Lanark, Pennsylvania, and down the street from the church that my grandfather had was a Quaker meeting house.
You mentioned that.
And the Quaker meeting house in 1901, 1902 time frame burned to the ground. And my grandfather opened up his church and had the Quakers come up and have their services in his church. Now my father, Wesley Horning Shirk Sr., was born about 1902, 1903, sometime shortly after the Quaker meeting house burned down. And he was named Wesley Horning Shirk, middle name Horning being the same as his father's middle name. When young Wesley, my father, was of age, he started to go to a public school because they didn't have any money. But the Quakers came to my grandparents. Grandmother was, her name was Agnes Shirk, and they came to her and my grandfather, Christian Shirk, and said, we would like to give your son Wesley allow him to come to a Quaker school. We will pay for his education, but we want him to have the experience of getting schooling at a Quaker school. Well, this is great. My grandparents, of course, couldn't afford this, but the Quakers said that in light of what he had done, my grandfather had done for them, they wanted to give my father an education in a Quaker school. So he went to a Quaker school, and he had good grades. But the important thing, the reason this was important was because of some classmates that he had. There were two ladies that from the very beginning, my father was somewhat interested in. One of them was a lady named Movina Fisher, and another one was named Mary Walcott. Now, Movina Fisher and Mary Walcott were good friends, and my father was interested in becoming friends with them, and they would actually do things together as young kids in school. And when my father got old enough that it was time for him to go to work, he decided that he would become a night watchman at a summer vacation spot up in Eaglesmere, Pennsylvania. So he applied and he got the job as night watchman in Eaglesmere, Pennsylvania. Now, it so happened happened, coincidentally, that both his friends from school, Malvina Fisher and Mary Walcott, and their families also went to Eaglesmere for a summer vacation. And they would go for a month at a time. And my father liked this very much. He would be working at night as a night watchman, then he would get some brief sleep during the day, and then he liked to go sailing, and he had for himself a sail canoe. And he named the sail canoe the Slow as Zell. Slow as Zell. While they were up there at Eaglesmere, my father became even more interested in these two young ladies, Mary Walcott and Malvina Fisher, and he would take them for rides in his sail canoe. Sail canoe can't hold very many people, 2 people at the most, and so he would take Mary out one time and Malvina out another time, and they thoroughly enjoyed riding around the lake. It got to the point where my father became so interested in these 2 ladies, and his diary indicates this, that he was deciding that he really wanted to get serious with one of them. And he settled on Malvina Fisher. And he eventually married Malvina Fisher, and she, of course, was my mother. But even after they were married, I still retained a relationship with Mary Walcott. And Mary Walcott married a young engineer from Texas whose name was John Carew, Q-U-E-R-E-A-U, Carew. And this is very important to part of the story, so you got to remember this. John Carew and Mary Carew and Wesley Shirk and Malvina Shirk would often go on trips together, go on vacations together, and they developed a very close relationship. My father, Wesley, went to work. He went to the University of Pennsylvania, and he was interested in engineering, and he got a degree as an electrical engineer. And his teacher, professor at the University of Pennsylvania, was a man by the name of Walter Seeley. Now, keep that name in mind, because that also played an important part in my own history. So my father went to work after he graduated from the University of Pennsylvania at the Leafax Company. And the Leafax Company made
brochures,
mathematical tables of all sorts of different mathematical relationships. But my father soon became bored with what he was doing at the Leafax Company, and so he decided he would go in business for himself. And he did that in 1929. He went in business for himself. Interestingly enough, that same year I was born, and I became Wesley Horning Shirk Jr., keeping the family name. when Wesley Jr., me, became of age, he started out in the public school, and the Quakers came to my parents, Wesley Sr. and Movina Shirk Sr. The Quakers came and said, look, we would like your son to attend a Quaker school. You've been very good to the Quakers, and we would like to honor that by having your children obtain a good education as a Quaker. So I was given a scholarship to Germantown Friends, a Quaker school. And interestingly enough, the Carews, John and Mary Carew, their children, also went to Germantown Friends. So you can see that these two families were staying rather closely related together. Now let's see. Turning over my sheet that reminds me what I want to talk about. Now, the Quakers are very religious people, and I was interested in religion at that age. I went to, when I started out, I went to Sunday school regularly, went to church regularly, and had Christian education in school, learned my Bible in school, and that had a profound effect on my early life. But as I grew up, although I had all the technical background of my Christian education, I'd learned the books of the Bible, for instance, in sequence. I'd memorized for my church 12 chapters or parts of chapters from Scripture. So I had a lot of background, but I did not have at that time what I considered a personal relationship with God. I knew the facts, but I wasn't aware really of God's presence in my life. And I remember driving back and forth to work when I was working in industry. I drove back and forth from Ambler to North Wales for a number of years, and I would listen to the radio. And I'd get the news station. And one day as I was driving along, I suddenly realized I'm hearing the news and I have no idea what it is saying. So I said, this is ridiculous. I don't want to continue going along just listening to the radio and not having any benefit from it. So I turned the radio off. And I said to myself, now what would I like to do with this time as I drive back and forth to work? Well, I'd had all this religious background as I was growing up, but I had never had an experience in knowing the presence of God. And so I thought to myself, you know, how do I know that God is present in my life? I was driving along and I was thinking, well, suppose somebody was sitting in the seat next to me here, how would I know that they were there? And I said, well, I reach out and I touch them. So I said, okay. So I reached out, the seat next to me, and I immediately felt the presence of someone there. And in my mind, it was the presence of God. God sitting right there in the seat next to me. And it was a profound experience. It was the first time I really became aware of God being present in my life. And so I accepted that, and then I began looking for ways in which I would continue to be aware of God's presence in my life. Well, one night, we put the kids to bed, and Jean and I were going to bed, and it was about 3 o'clock in the morning, and the telephone rang. And so the phone was right next to me in bed, and I lifted up the receiver, and I said hello, and they said, "Hello, is Sam there?" And I said, "No, this is a private home, and there's no one here by that name." He said, "Wait a minute." And another voice came on the phone. And the person said, "We'd like to speak to Sam." And I said, "There's nobody here by that name." "Well, is this 646-2306? I still remember that telephone number. This made such an impression on me. I said, "Yes, this is 646-2306. We want to talk to Sam." I said, "There's no Sam here. This is a private residence." They said, "Wait a minute." He came back again, and he said, "Is this 717-646-2306? I said, "No, this is 215-646-2306. "Oh," he said, "I guess we have the wrong area code. I'm sorry to disturb you." And he hung up. Well, by that time I was wide awake. And so I decided, well, I'd get up and go to the bathroom. So our house was built so that there were 2 bedrooms on the first floor and 2 bedrooms on the second floor. And as I opened the door from our bedroom, immediately on the left was a hallway that went down to the living room. And next was a door that led to our kitchen. And then was the door at the end of the hallway, the short hallway that led to the bathroom. And then on the right was the door to another bedroom. So as I passed the kitchen door, I smelled something. Something was burning. And I opened the kitchen door, and here on the stove, one of us, and I don't know, it was either me or Jean, but one of us had left something in the skillet cooking on the stove, and it was smoking very profusely. And the back of the formica and the back of the stove was smoking in return. It had gotten so hot that it was beginning to smoke. This was all ready to become a major fire, and we would not have known it if it hadn't been for that phone call. So I quickly turned the stove off and put the skillet in the sink and cooled it down and made sure there was nothing else out of order, and went to the bathroom and went back to bed. And I didn't tell Jean about this until the next morning. The next morning I said, I had had this experience the night before, and I said, I don't know why we got a telephone call in the middle of the night at the very time that I had to be awakened so that I could take care of a potential very, very serious situation. But it hit me right away. you know, this was God acting in my life. There was some reason that that telephone call came through. That had never happened before, and interestingly enough, it never happened since. It was that one time, in that one period, that was most essential to my being awakened and take action. If it had happened earlier, there wouldn't have been smoke for me to smell. If it had happened much later, there would have probably been a fire. So I am absolutely 100% convinced that God was interfering in my life at that time to save me from a serious catastrophe. I want to tell you about another part in my life that some of you may not know about, and that is back after the end of World War II, when they were still continuing the draft. And it was time for me to register in the draft. And I decided, based on my background and education and my understanding of my religion and my experiences with being close to God, that I could not really be a part of a service that would be based on war.